This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Christopher Chabris. He is the author of a book called Nobody's Fool: Why We Get Taken In and What We Can Do About It. His co-author, Daniel Simons, they have both appeared on my podcast in prior years. This is one of these scientific method 101 thinkings. Be a skeptic, dive in, ask questions, tear it apart, find out what's inside, get to the bottom of it. I say it in this conversation to Christopher, but I firmly believe that if the framework that him and Daniel lay out could be applied to our most controversial issues, we would all be much better off as a species. The scientific method is magic. Digging in and unpacking things, finding out the truth, searching for the truth at least, is magic. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation today with Christopher Chabris and get at the big topic of Nobody's Fool: Why We Get Taken In and What We Can Do About it. I hope you enjoy. This is one of these topics that comes across my desk, Chris, where even though I knew you a little bit, we had talked before. This topic, the topic of your newest book, I really did not even have to open the damn thing to know that I wanted to talk to you about this subject. Now, I see a lot of books, a lot of publishers, a lot of PR people. Mike, check this author out, check this author out. And a lot of things these days feel lightweight. They don't feel like there's some grist there, some meat to the bone. But I saw where you guys were going and I was like, oh yes, this is perfect for America today. Whether or not America will like Chris and Daniel after it's over, I don't know. From my perspective, it's a perfect conversation for America today.
I'm glad you saw that right away. I think that's what we were going for. We really wanted to apply our expertise, our knowledge of cognitive science and cognitive psychology to something that is really of great importance and practical value as well.
Let me read something that came out of some of my prep work for this conversation. It's a line from your world. How can we evaluate whether a new claim, product, therapy, intervention, or study is promising something that's too good to be true? ? Even though you're the cognitive scientist, the two of you guys have written this book, there's a side of me that's even nervous to bring that particular question up. Because how many issues do we have? A lot of the ones you guys stayed a little bit away from stuff that's really what I would call politically divisive. That's some of the stuff that seemingly where in the last handful of years, this perspective, like the question that I just stated there, essentially the scientific method is so terribly important.
Yeah, that is correct. We did deliberately try to not write a book that was about all of the most hot button topics where one might be fooled or deceived or misled. There's a lot of writing about all of those already. What we wanted to do was really step back from all the heat that those things generate and all the deep plunge into various details of each and every one of those things. We wanted to step back and say, what is it about how we think, daily thinking habits we have, and the way our perceptions sort of attune to certain kinds of features of information which attract us to it? What is it about all of that that makes it hard sometimes for us to answer that simple question? Is it too good to be true, or misleads us in other ways, gets us involved in things that we should have checked out first, and can sometimes lead us down a long path and into a deep pit of financial loss or some other kind of bad consequences? I think the question too good to be true, in one sense, it doesn't really tell you much because it presumes that you already have a good sense of what's too good to be true. So if you can get a clear answer to the question, is this too good to be true? Well, then you're done. If the answer is yes, it's too good to be true, then you can move on. You don't need to spend any more time investigating that quote unquote opportunity or offer or claim or whatever. But how do you know that it's too good to be true? And what are the signs of a situation where something is a claim or an offer is too good to be true? What is it that we might notice that would tip us off to it being too good to be true? What are the things we might fail to consider when trying to decide if it's too good to be true? That's where we go more in the book. And of course, explaining why it is that way. Why do our minds do these terrible things to us, like get us involved in Ponzi schemes and have us believing in quack therapies and so on?
So we're in a situation where, again, for America, there's so much division. To me, it feels like if I take your book, if I take your work, and I apply it to some of the most divisive issues that have unfolded in America, let's say since 2016, it feels like, hey, you're basically challenging us all to think like scientists, to apply the scientific method. And it used to be that you could do that if the result was good or bad. We all used to still accept the science. What do you think has changed? Because I think if we took this work that you guys have done and we applied it to these divisive issues, some of which might come up because they're interesting in this conversation, but if we applied them to these divisive issues since, let's say, 2016, I think there'd be a lot of people calling you guys names. There'd be a lot of people saying, hold on, you're on the wrong side, or hold on, you guys are conspiracy theorists. And all you've done here is say, we don't know anything. We're just walking in. We're blank slates. What's going on? Let's pick it apart like scientists used to do. Do you think about that as you were doing this work, that if you apply this mentality that you guys have laid out, that a lot of people won't be happy with you?
First of all, I think that it's true that probably anyone from any side political side could find something to object to in this book. And that's good, because I think we wanted to touch on topics that were of relevance. We mentioned vaccines, we mentioned politics, we mentioned a wide variety of different situations where people misled themselves, were misled others, cheated them, scammed them, and so on. There's an increasingly partisan tinge to almost all of those things. Why that is a bigger question than we certainly try to answer in our book. Our book is not about why there's polarization and why people disagree on so many things and so on, but it's definitely a good point, because the polarization makes it harder to see and to achieve consensus on what's a scam and what's not a scam. However, I'm not sure that people on one political side or the other, they might find a lot to agree in too, even while they find a couple of things to disagree with in what we wrote. As far as the scientific method goes, you're never going to find me saying the scientific method is bad, that people shouldn't know more about it, and so on, in as much as I'm a scientist. Never going to disagree with that. And I do think scientific thinking is important to teach. When we teach concepts like critical thinking as the application of the scientific method or the academic method to everyday life is often described, we have to be more critical thinkers. I don't think that's necessarily what's lacking. There's a lot of research that shows that people can be quite critical, and often appropriately critical, of claims that they disagree with or that come from sources they disagree with or don't like. The problem is turning that criticism inward on things you like, things you generated yourself, things that appeal to you. It's not that the scientific method is lacking. It's that it's employed rather selectively, I guess you could say. Also, ironically, people often will dismiss science itself or the work of good science, the results of good science, with criticisms because they don't like even what the science says. And one could say that that's a relatively new development. It's not completely new development. After all, there have been controversies over things like the theory of evolution since it first started. That has been mainstream biology for, 150 years or something like that? Not just mainstream, but the central idea of all of biology in some ways, and many other sciences that relate to biology. It's still controversial, even to this day.
Probably only controversial in a relatively small part of the population, I'm guessing. Maybe I'm wrong.
I don't know about that, actually. How often is there a trial over high school curriculum and so on? Probably not very often. How often are there protests? I haven't looked at any polls on this, so I can't tell you numbers, but often when you look at polls about beliefs that one group of people might find bizarre or at least fringe, you find a substantial minority of people agree with those beliefs. So I'm not sure about that, but certainly it's not the kind of thing that you hear about in the news all the time. We've got other things right now in science that we're fighting about and fighting more about. Criticisms of vaccines go back a very long way. And so I agree with you. A lot of it's accelerated quite a bit around that inflection point of 2016.
Let me keep it at that for a second on the vaccine part. I'm going to try and ask an interesting question here. Just in full disclosure, I think it was either 2020 or 2021 when my sister recommended that I read this white paper or this research on the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. And they thought there was some benefit to get your booster on this, which I did do. And then I think it was the fall of 2021, I did 2 vax of the COVID. In hindsight, I don't know if I'm happy about that exactly, but I think the thing that's interesting about vaccines, and hopefully you can give a perspective from your work that maybe can help people, is it seems like that both sides of the table, if we were to use the COVID vaccine, for example, it seems like both sides of the table could come to the table with a certain amount of research that says, I either needed this or I didn't need this. I think there's valid information on both sides, depending who you might be, the population you are, the comorbidities you might have had at the time, et cetera. But we didn't seem to have that situation where you got this controversial issue where you had people perhaps applying the scientific method in different ways to come to different conclusions. But it seems like we should have all just been happy with the idea that maybe there was 2 sides that didn't agree. That's the part that's so strange to me, is that we've reached this point. If we really dive into what you guys have done, this should bring people closer to the quote truth than farther away. Take my point, though, on the idea of the vaccinations, why we couldn't just come to the table with differing opinions, where it had to be the hammer of I'm right or you're right. And again, as I read that sentence to start our conversation, how can we evaluate whether our new claim, product, therapy, intervention, or study is promising something that's too good to be true? A simple question. We're really not allowed to ask that question at that point in time in history, were we?
I want to start by saying I'm not an expert on public health, not an expert on managing public health emergencies or anything like that. So there's a lot of dimensions to the question of who should get vaccinated and when and who, if anyone, shouldn't, and so on, that have to do with managing a public health emergency as opposed to something like measles, mumps, and rubella, or an annual flu shot or something like that. You had an unprecedented worldwide pandemic. The disease that the virus caused seemed to be very severe in many people. And also it was putting strains on the health system, which I think is something people seem to have forgotten nowadays. But a lot of the discussion, sort of early on in the pandemic and when these surges happened was, would hospitals and the health system be overwhelmed, unable to deal with the number of people who were getting sick? That was a real concern. People were drawing comparisons to the Spanish flu 100 years earlier. And so I don't want to pretend to be an expert on all of those issues, but I think I can say from the cognitive psychology point of view that a lot of vaccine discussions we see nowadays neglect some of those other dimensions. It's true, it's a personal decision for anyone whether to have any medical treatment. That's basically just a baseline, a standard that we all operate by. But there were many other dimensions regarding the effects on other people, the effects on the health system, the economic system, and so on that were in play at the time.
I think that's what's interesting about your work is because, again, if we keep ourselves to the point of asking questions, looking for risks, looking for groups where the risks might be higher or lower, looking beyond just the American borders, for example. I happened to have been in Vietnam at the time, the least obese country in the world compared to America, the most obese country in the world. And so that was clearly a huge risk factor. As you say, cognitive scientists digging in, scientific method, that getting to the place where we can all just say, are we all in this for the search for the truth? I take from your work that you guys are saying, hey, let's search for the truth.
What you saw with COVID vaccines was a lot of motivated reasoning. And motivated reasoning, of course, is when you let your deployment of logic or your agreement with a logical argument be affected by how much you like the outcome or your desire to achieve a certain outcome. It's hard to know where to begin, but when the first vaccines were amazingly, shockingly in clinical trials within months of the onset of this pandemic, that was a really shocking technological leap. people were saying, oh, it takes 4 to 10 years to develop a vaccine for any virus. So everybody get used to lockdowns, masks, all that other stuff, and so on. And then within months, there's a new vaccine in clinical trials. And when the data was out, when the results were out, when it was looked at, I think the results at that time seemed quite clear that the scientific method had been applied and something that was quite highly effective against the virus that was circulating at that time had been created.
Is there a side of you that's even uncomfortable to talk about it?
In the case of, are vaccines effective for COVID? I think the answer is clear. I would disagree with people who would say that's an open question. I don't think any of the arguments that say these vaccines are not effective are good arguments. I think often they are arguments based on misconceptions or maybe having been misled to think other things or misleading oneself to think other things. The classic model of vaccines was you get a shot when you're old or something like that, and you never get a disease for the rest of your life. Or you get a booster shot once or twice in your life and you're protected for life and you never get it. And that's a misconception that people have had, perhaps due to the efficacy of campaigns to get rid of things like smallpox and other diseases, that one shot pretty much worked forever. And every virus is different and so on. Again, I'm not a virologist, but there was, I think, a lot of misunderstanding about what an effective vaccine was. And a lot of people came up with arguments against vaccines and basically were making things up, or at least taking the most shoddy, inaccurate, inapplicable information and presenting it as though it was the stake through the heart of the idea that one of the COVID vaccines was actually effective.
Let me throw it to you this way in terms of staying in the headspace of where you guys go, how to evaluate a claim. So I think the interesting part is you start to dig deep into any subject, and we're going to go into other subjects in a second because we don't want to stay in vaccines the whole conversation. But okay, COVID vaccine was effective. Okay, was not taking the vaccine effective? Okay, who is the COVID vaccine most effective for? Who were the people that died the most of COVID? What was their age? What was their risk group? What was their comorbidities, et cetera? And so I think this is the part where I enjoy seeing your work. Let me sharpen the scalpel some. Let me dig deeper beyond just the headlines. There's one thing that drives me crazy right now when I hear the conversation coming out of America, however many people, I don't know the exact number, but 1 million people died. Well, then my next question is, who? And then I want to know what age. I want to know what condition they were in, because it didn't appear that I was in those particular risk groups. And this is the part that seems, if I really stick with where you guys have gone, then I should be able to take that scalpel and keep carving down and asking more questions, as opposed to just staying the 35,000 foot view.
Yeah, those are all good questions to ask. But I think that when you ask a question, you have to have the data available to answer it. The best data on these kinds of questions about a vaccine or a drug or any medical treatment would come from a randomized controlled trial, which were done. The reason, as we all know, for looking at randomized controlled trials as opposed to other kinds of data is that only in a randomized controlled trial is it randomly assigned who gets the vaccine and who doesn't, or who gets the drug and who gets the placebo, or who gets the whatever the medical intervention is and who doesn't get it. There's a lot of other biases that go into someone's choice of whether to take a medication or receive a vaccine or something like that, so that it's very hard to evaluate who's it effective for, who does it have more side effects for, and so on, outside of the context of a randomized trial. So all those questions are great to ask. But in January 2021, there was no data to answer those questions, or at least the data was not very good. But sure, over time, we should develop a more refined understanding of all those things. I think we're actually, maybe, this is just my outsider's perspective from following this discourse, I'm not sure we're developing as good a perspective as we should, partly because the whole concept was so politicized from the outset.
That's my point overall here.
But the other thing I would add is that I think this goes back to something you said earlier in one of your earlier questions. Yes, we should all apply the scientific method as much as possible, but I think, yes, we should also recognize sometimes that when we're doing that, we may be looking for things we want to find. We may be selectively looking at data to support our desired outcomes and so on. It is hardly easy, even for scientists, to avoid that.
On the COVID example, that applies to those people that believe that the vax was great and they need to keep taking the vax on a regular basis, and the people that said, I never took any, and I know plenty of people like this, I never took any, and I'm fine. That's the interesting rub here, is that instead of that being like a conversation where both sides could just say, oh, that's cool, you made that choice. And the other side says, oh, that's cool, you made that choice. But now it's become, let's kill each other.
I don't know about that part.
Figuratively.
We also have to be aware of the fact that a lot of people who didn't take the vaccine are no longer with us. If you look around at the survivors from any kind of historical process, you'll get an inaccurate understanding of what caused them to survive.
That would also take me back to one of my questions, which is who died exactly? How old were they? How many comorbidities did they have? Sharpening the scalpel to dig deep. For example, if I shift you out of vaccines for a second, I take it to something like how people can fall for a Madoff, how people can fall for Elizabeth Holmes, how people can fall for these folks. I have a quick and dirty example that I use for the Madoff situation that I say to people, if you ever have a fund manager or a mutual fund or anybody that promises you that you can make 1 or 2% every month, no down months for decades. And I said, they're either a scam or a fund that is soon to blow up because the strategy is so bad. That's always been my quick and dirty way to explain it. Me personally, I would never, at least having some understanding of how funds flow and returns flow, that'd be my quick and dirty way. But on the flip side, a lot of people looked at it and said, oh my gosh, this is the best thing since sliced bread. I can get 2% a month, no down months. Everybody knows this guy. He's a star and he's a legend. And it's really interesting how differing groups can see the same situation in an entirely different way.
Yeah. And by the way, your example of strategy that's going to blow up reminds me of one of the offering. I don't even want to call it an offering document because this area was so lightly regulated that it was just a pitch that appeared online shortly after the whole FTX implosion happened last fall. Someone posted a pitch document for, I think it was Alameda Research, which was their quote hedge fund, I guess, that was associated with FTX. And it said something like, we've achieved at least 10% per month. I'm making up the numbers, but we've achieved 10% per month for the last 6 months as an argument for investing with them. And when I saw that, I thought, wow, that's about as close to the edge of Madoff-like promise, but times 10. Sure enough, it blew up in the most blow up possible way.
What's interesting about Madoff is that Madoff was attracting very wealthy people, word of mouth, under the radar, I think pre-internet, essentially. Whereas the FTX example, I would say, was probably more people that had very little money and just wanted to get rich quick overnight and were willing to just put all reason to the side and jump in. It was, you could have the really wealthy jet set that was giving money to Madoff, and then the inexperienced, no money, jumping in and saying, I'm going to be rich in crypto overnight because I saw one guy online make it. And then the online part, I think, in crypto has been an accelerant. You might want to comment on that too.
In general, social media, the internet, various forms of technology, mobile phones, et cetera, accelerate the distribution of scams and frauds and make more of them available to more people, which oftentimes is the primary strategy that the scammer is using, is basically just to find as many possible victims at once, knowing that a few of them will come through. We can talk about that separately. That goes back to the old Nigerian scam, which was a pioneer of this whole method in some ways. There are some similarities between crypto and Madoff. I mean, one is that although FTX was, I think, the most publicly out there in this space, they use celebrities, they use branding stadiums, they use all of these traditional marketing ideas normally associated with products like beer, movies, and so on. It was still like a social process. One way that people get hooked into these kinds of things is through a channel of familiarity. So in the case of FTX, it was familiarity of celebrities and associated ideas like the Miami Heat basketball team, Tom Brady. I think Steph Curry might have been an endorser. Oddly enough, Taylor Swift turned down endorsing FTX because either she thought to ask or someone told her to ask whether these were unregistered securities that were being offered, and wouldn't that be a problem for me to be endorsing unregistered securities? In any case, it was a social process of making the whole thing seem more familiar and legitimate by association. And that's how Madoff actually worked too. He himself was associated with the legitimate financial industry and was a legitimate financial player with his trading firm and with his chairmanship of the NASDAQ and with all of his associations with charities and philanthropies. He had a number of celebrity people in his fund. They didn't talk about it too much. It was word of mouth was as good as Tom Brady is doing it, I should do it. My uncle is doing it, I should do it. It's a very similar process. Tries to short circuit a lot of that critical thinking by exploiting this sort of relationship of trust or familiarity. That's not the only thing to Madoff or to FTX by any means. And one thing that people should understand about scams and frauds and all that is that usually the complicated ones, like the ones we're talking about now, really work by hijacking a number of our different cognitive foibles, or at least cognitive systems and tendencies that normally are very useful. Things like normally if someone you know tells you something, you should be more likely to believe it than if someone you don't know tells you something. Somebody you know tells you to invest with this guy, you should be more likely to believe it than if some random stranger tells you to invest with this guy. But that's exactly what scammers are doing, is they're figuring out those weak points in the defenses. It's like, here's a door that they usually don't lock. The door through the uncle, or the door through the charity board that they're on, or the door through the celebrity, something like that. That's one of the many techniques that these complicated scams need in order to survive, especially the Madoff one, which went on for at least 15 years and maybe much more than that, depending on whose story you believe.
Accept less, check more. I got to tell you, as you brought up the Nigerian scam, I think it was 1996, which would have been probably about 1 year, maybe 18 months after most everybody that was alive was starting to use email. Well, that's actually not a fair statement. I think it was about 1996, and I received one of these Nigerian scam emails. I remember thinking, well, this is kind of interesting, because I wasn't, at that point in time of the internet, I wasn't getting these kinds of emails. My inbox was not filled with 20 scams. I was getting all kinds of normal emails. In the midst of the normal emails, there's this one very interesting email. And I remember calling up a friend of mine. I'm like, hey, man, this is really interesting. What do you think about this? He starts laughing. He's like, you idiot. That's the Nigerian email scam. This is 1996. So I can't imagine how many people, though, didn't really have exposure. They came into using email and stuff. I remember my grandmother, and she used to have everything under the sun for subscribe to some magazine or this or that, because there was a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. I can't imagine how many elderly folks have given away their hard-earned money to these people. And these scams and the phishing scams and stuff that you guys talk about, it's a lot more sophisticated these days. Like I saw one the other day where you had to really look at the URL because they were using a Citibank URL with a slightly different .com extension. And I was like, damn, that's clever.
I love your Nigerian email scam story, because probably you got that right at the point when the famous Nigerian email scam began, because that's when email became accessible to the scammers. But before that, it had been a fax scam. And before that, it was a mail scam through letters. And you can imagine how much less efficient it was going back in time to when they had to actually send letters to people with these offers. Nowadays, it's industrial strength, and spam filters pretty good at catching it. It sounds like you were there right at the beginning when the scammers discovered email and they could reach many more people. And you also pointed out another good thing, which is, and this is a strategy that we talk about in our book, showing it to a friend, just getting someone else to look at the same thing who doesn't have the same emotional investment or motivated reasoning. They have not been thinking for a while about this email and how it could make them rich. So they may look at it without that built-in emotional bias. They will not have had the sunk costs of, they've already spent time thinking about this proposition, maybe exchanging an email or two with the scammers and so on. They can really give you a different perspective. And we uncovered, or discovered, I should say, a lot of examples where people who did fall into deep frauds were actually advised by trusted advisors not to do it, but went ahead and did it anyhow. Or people who didn't fall in got the same advice and decided to follow it. So not only do you have to consult a friend or some kind of trusted advisor, but you've got to take them seriously. You've got to be open to the possibility that if they tell you not to do something, that it's a scam or whatever, of changing course, or at least taking their advice seriously.
I've got a good one for you. I forgot all about this. I don't know what year this is. I want to say 98 or 99. I got invited to a Ritz-Carlton luncheon. And I knew a lot of people that were going, and they were all pretty much bankers and real estate people and whatnot. This was in Northern Virginia at the time where I was living. These folks that invited us were going to pitch us this thing where we could get a tax break. And the pitch was this, if I recall correctly. They had a cemetery, and the cemetery was, I could be partially wrong, but this is the idea. It was losing money. So you could buy shares in the cemetery that was losing money, and you would then have this write-off that you could use against your taxes. And I called my CPA up and I said, hey, what do you think about this? He gives me this technical explanation as to why it's no good. And he finally says, if you do this, you're stupid. And I was like, don't worry, I'm not going to do it. I realized it was a scam because I could see all these people at the Ritz-Carlton luncheon. It was like 20 people. And they were so excited about all this tax money they were going to save. They could basically write off all of their earnings by buying shares and the loss-leading cemetery plot nonsense, whatever. Anyways, I was the only person that did not do it. Every one of them that did it were audited and stuck with paying huge tax bills plus interest, et cetera, over many, many years.
There's a nice example of, this is not a piece of advice in our book, but I guess we can give it now. Don't take tax advice from the people who are trying to sell you something unless they're your regular tax advisor. They're already on your side in some sense. If you go to a sales pitch and they tell you, here are the tax consequences, and that exactly works out in the favor of you paying them for something, you need to get a third party to look at that who's not invested in the idea that you should send them money. You're going to pay your tax accountant the same amount of money to do your tax returns, whether you invest in the cemetery deal or not. So there's a disinterested piece of advice that you can rely on. Now, your bullshit detector may have been going off already for other reasons. There may have been many other things in their pitch. For example, if it's such a good deal, why do they need to pay people with a fancy Ritz-Carlton lunch and so on to get them to invest? You can invest in Apple stock without going to a luncheon, and nobody's paying you to do that. It always seems a little dodgy to me if you're getting gifted something for investing.
The Cialdini reciprocity was on full display. We're giving you this nice thing. Now you're going to give us something.
Yeah, exactly. And also the Nigerian principle applies here too, which is they probably invited many, many people to that luncheon. Their strategy was anyone who decides they're going to come to a luncheon and perhaps get a great investment opportunity and save on their taxes and so on is already in our top 2% potential customers. So we've gotten the top 1 or 2%, or maybe less than that, to already A, identify themselves to us so we know which ones they are, B, start sinking their own time and money and emotional commitment into this process, make themselves open, as you mentioned, to other vectors of influence once they get there. I don't know what the pitch involved, but it probably involved a lot of different hooks and so on that we talk about in our framework.
I do recall that everyone that was at that particular lunch, they were friends or associates. Everyone knew everyone. So the person that was doing the pitch played on that too. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think the pitchers did end up spending some time in the big house, I believe.
Bad tax shelter schemes, I think that's been the death of entire accounting firms, if I recall my history correctly. This, I think, is an area that's strewn with the bodies of a lot of scams and scammers. Is there any more attractive proposition than saving money on your taxes? Because that just feels like money you're throwing away, much as you might appreciate that we need to have a government. The government does important things with their money. It's just money you send out every day, and you don't feel like you're getting something tangible in return. So cutting some of that off is extremely appealing proposition for a scammer.
As I think about all the different topic areas here that y'all touch on and how to take people through, my shorthand is it's deeper than this. People have to check out the book, but it's really getting people to think critically, to think like a scientist, to dig in. Not that I'm going to take you there, but I keep coming back to the idea that if America could allow itself to take this critical view in the current land of politics, that's not to say all sides would have kumbaya and a big group hug in the middle at the end of the day, but I think some of the intensity would drop down and there would probably be more people in the middle, so to speak, and maybe the polls would still be there. But I find it amazing that you and I could actually talk all about these different subject areas and how to break them apart. But the moment you try to apply this type of mindset to the most gasoline toxic issues in America that need this the most, it just doesn't, you can't go there. You can't go there.
It's not all gloom and doom. I think often what gets played up in the media, in many other sources, are disagreements and situations where people really weren't listening to each other. I'm not sure it's entirely that way everywhere. And I'm not sure it's a permanent condition, or at least I hope it's not. But I do think there are forces that have realized that by associating non-political ideas with political identities, they can get farther with whatever they're trying to do. There are definitely, I think, some deliberate efforts to politicize things. And this is all around the world. This is not just the US, even though we might be focusing on what's going on in the US. But there are political forces, I'll just put it at that, who are deliberately try to spread misinformation, disinformation, the false claims about history, science, and whatnot to achieve their own ends. And I agree with you. If we could all learn a little more about how to evaluate those claims and how to think more soberly about them and maybe follow some of the ideas in our book, that would be a great benefit. I'm entirely with you there.
I think it's interesting you bring up the point about it's not just America, and it's not. But I guess if I was to sharpen the scalpel some and I was to try to be an observer, digging back into my graduate school international relations training, is that I look around the world and I say, okay, China, Russia, Vietnam, other Asian countries might have a very different political perspective and a very different cultural perspective than what we would commonly refer to as the West, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America, and Western Europe. That's another piece of the puzzle. If we're going to start to think about the whole idea of nobody's fool, digging in, there are people that can look at the same data sets and have an entirely different view about how they want to move forward and behave, structure a country, run a country, etc.
I'm not an expert on many countries at all. I'm not sure I'm even an expert on the US, but I think that fact, just that different people, whether it's because they're Asian or Western or Russian or British or whatever, can look at the same set of facts and come to a different conclusion, maybe relates to the idea that we present, which is that really strong assumptions that we have made, we call them commitments, which are extremely strong assumptions that you rarely, if ever, question. They can determine a lot of your decision-making process, A, without you realizing it, and B, without you realizing that they are leading you to come up with absurd conclusions to maintain consistency with those pre-existing beliefs. I don't know what the contrasting beliefs of Asian and Western societies might be, but if you look at smaller groups of people, you can find many examples of groups that were almost defined by a particular belief that led them down paths that obviously were absurd. So just give one example. There's this concept called the Mandela effect. It originated when a person realized they had a memory of Nelson Mandela having died in prison in South Africa in the 1980s. Now, in reality, Nelson Mandela didn't die in prison in South Africa in the 1980s. He was released from prison in the 1990s. He became president of South Africa and basically led the end of apartheid, which was a world historical event. And he died in 2013 or somewhere around then. But she believed so strongly in this memory and that she had seen news coverage of it and that there were riots around the world after he died in prison. Critically, she managed to find some other people who also had the same memory. So they collectively decided, well, our memory must be correct. The fact that everybody else believes otherwise, and the fact that everything on the internet says otherwise, and the fact that we can't find any books in the library that document Mandela's death in the 80s and so on, means there must be something going on. Alternate timelines, forked timelines of history. We're living in a different timeline than other people, or people have scrubbed the internet of all the references to the facts we know are true about Nelson Mandela and so on. Otter beliefs that the state of Wyoming doesn't exist. It all comes from having this commitment that my memory, backed up by these other people who have the same memory, must be true. That can lead you to conclude that there are alternate timelines and worldwide conspiracies to edit the internet and so on. That's one sort of extreme example of how you can start with an unalterable belief and twist yourself into knots trying to figure out how everything else could be consistent with that. That's an extreme version of, I think, what you're alluding to, which is how cultural differences might bias one group to get to one conclusion, different group gets to a different conclusion, even if they start with the same fundamental facts.
As I was reading your book, I was thinking, what bias do you guys have? If there was no examples in the book and it was just the facts, ma'am, the structure to determine, am I a fool? Am I not a fool? No examples. I'm sure you probably think in this conversation, I think Mike has a bias. Maybe I'm thinking, maybe Chris has a bias. But if we took all the examples out of the book and we just had this structure, I'd be very comfortable saying amongst learned people, amongst people that want to come to the table with a sense of truth seeking, I'd be very comfortable saying, apply this methodology, this style of thinking, apply it to any and every controversial issue. I feel very comfortable with that.
That's good to hear. You said if there were no examples, do the examples make you feel that it's equally valuable? I mean, we do have a lot of examples. We talked about some of them in this conversation. Madoff. We've got probably 100 different scams, frauds, deceptions, and so on in there somewhere or another.
I think the hard part is, and I understand what you guys tried to do, because let's face it, we all can see what happens if you step on the wrong toe. A family member could be screaming the next day. No one knows what's going to happen in this current climate. But I guess for me, nobody's going to really get mad if Madoff gets ripped. Nobody's going to really get mad if we apply this scientific thinking to observing and figuring out exactly what Madoff did, how some people saw it. That was the CPA from Boston. I forget his last name, Markopoulos, I think. How he figured it out versus how other people didn't figure it out. No one's going to get really mad about that conversation. Maybe the people that, for example, that were on the losing side, and I think a lot of them got a lot of money back, but maybe the people on the losing side personally are not going to feel like, oh God, I don't want to be reminded of this all the time. But it's not going to really cause a fighting situation. But however, if we put on the table issues like, for example, the most topical issues in America today, I would sum them up as three things: COVID, gender, Trump. You put those on the table and you say, okay, you've probably got your opinion. Now, let's put whatever sub-issues come out of these three main issues on the table. Then let's apply Chris and Daniel's perspective to it. That'd be a fun exercise. However, my humble opinion is the politics of America is never going to allow this.
Well, you can do all those exercises. There are all kinds of claims and controversies you can try to subject to an analysis. And I think what you're saying is, what if you took Trump as a broad subject? It's hard to say we're going to look at Trump through the lens of the framework in our book.
I'll give you an example. As far as every American thought from 2016 to 2018, while the FBI was investigating, a lot of people probably thought Trump was a Russian agent. He was a stooge of Putin, something to this effect. All these years later, it turned out not to be true. When you talk about nobody's fool, that's an interesting, even as I say that, there are people listening, perhaps yourself, that are saying, well, Mike, you don't really know the full story. There's a little bit more to it. Well, if I just blur my eyes and go to Occam's razor for a second, the guy's not going to jail. These things didn't come to fruition. But I realize as I say that, half my audience perhaps is saying, oh, he's just in the bag for Trump. And the other half is saying, well, yeah, he kind of understands what. You see, this is where it gets so interesting. Whereas if we forced ourselves to say, okay, let's pick a particular controversial issue about Trump. Was he or was he not a Russian agent? Then let's go down the rabbit hole and let's all collectively sit at the table, whether you're on the left or the right, and let's figure out if that's true. We don't do that anymore.
When it comes to a controversial topic, for example, was Trump some kind of Russian agent? I like to find the places where I can say something with more certainty. I don't think anyone really ever knew the truth about that. There's a lot of contestable issues there, like what even is the definition of Russian agent, stooge? There's many things that would go into even establishing a proposition that you could then have a clear argument with a correct answer to.
That was a mouthful, by the way, because that gets to the whole point. If there's no clarity, my God, everything's emotional at that point in time.
Well, for example, the word collusion, that means different things to different people. This happens all the time in politics. Politics is not the place to go for conceptual clarity about what our terms mean.
No, but if we get to your structure, your framework, which I think is very valuable to get people applying your framework to anything that looks confusing. Was Trump a Russian agent? Was Trump not a Russian agent? Your framework allows somebody, if they have the time, if they have the desire, there's a lot of things people can read out there to start to go down that rabbit hole. They're just more interesting examples. It could be Madoff, it could be Trump, it could be Biden, it could be Elizabeth Holmes. The specific claim, as you just sharpen the scalpel on me, what's the specific claim? And then dig through it. I love that. I wish in this 2023 version of America that we all worked like that. I think we did at one point in time. I would hazard a guess. You tell me, back in the day, in school, all these different programs you're going through, how did you feel? I mean, you must have felt like, hey, I'm going to go in and I'm going to dig and I'm going to find out what I'm going to find out. And you didn't necessarily know what you were going to find out.
Two experiences come to mind. One was our 11th grade American history teacher had this exercise where we all actually received a copy of the New York Times, which was in essence the local newspaper, as well as national and international newspaper. We all got a copy every weekday morning in school, and he would circle 3 or 4 articles that we had to read that day. And so we had this daily homework. We had to read these articles, and I think periodically we had to write a little reflection in a notebook on them or something like that. I've almost never heard of that kind of thing happening anywhere else. I thought it was great because it really gets you to pay more attention to a lot of things you might not be paying attention to normally. Of course, it helps that he was, at least to my knowledge, not trying to direct us down any partisan path or whatever, but just picking what he thought would be interesting and fit in with the curriculum and what we were talking about that day and be an interesting set of stories. Then in college, one of the best experiences I had was getting really interested in a research question and wanting to write about it so much that I went to the library at night and just sat there pulling off books and journals and following the references and all of that. Nowadays, we would call it a rabbit hole, but that's research. Also, like research is in some ways going down a rabbit hole as long as you're pursuing legitimate, reasonable sources and not hearing whispers from people in the alley or whatever. Coming back to this whole question of politics, what we can say, what I feel like I'm on very solid ground saying is that most people who participate in these debates, the loudest voices, are often the most overconfident, or their claims are out of calibration with the amount of information they really have. And most of the time, they don't realize it. Sometimes there are people who are just deliberately trying to mislead you by spreading information they know is wrong or they don't believe is right. But a lot of times people are spreading stuff that they believe is right, and their level of belief is not justified by the evidence they have, and they don't realize it. And maybe if they read our book, they might get some idea why. And one of the main problems is that, and this is the very first or second concept in the book that I think is relevant here, which is when we focus on one thing, we don't realize how much of relevance we're missing, especially when people are controlling our focus and people are curating the stream of information that's coming to us. We may not realize what else we're missing. I know everyone on every side will say, oh yeah, that's what the other side is doing. But it's something that's always happening. It's not being done by a side or to us or whatever. It's automatically happening to us because we can only focus on one thing at a time. And it takes a lot of effort to step back and ask yourself what's missing, what's not here that would be of relevance. This happens all the time. We have examples in the book from marketing and sales pitches and financial advice, where some company is offering you stock picking advice and they say, well, this guy picked Amazon in 1997 and he picked Tesla in 2011 or something like that. And you hear what he has to say now. Well, you're being curated 2 examples of what might have been lucky guesses. And by the way, we don't know when he sold his Amazon and Tesla. We only know that he may have bought it at a good time. We don't know when he sold it. So we don't really know how much money he made on those. That's a clear example. We put examples like that in the book because it's easy to see, okay, here's what we're not being told. What picks did he make that didn't make any money or that lost money? What picks did he fail to make that he should have if he was really such a visionary, like Google and MasterCard even, and so on? It's easy to see how what you're being shown is unrepresentative example of the information you would need to make a rational decision. It's much harder to get to that point, that realization, once it becomes political. So we don't have too many examples there. We don't have an analysis of how much should we believe that Trump was a Russian agent. Like you say, you can apply the framework we develop. And if you try to be objective about it, you can maybe get some leverage on those more thorny, controversial questions.
The book, Nobody's Fool, Why We Get Taken In and What We Can Do About It. Cool stuff, Christopher, with your co-author, Daniel. Where can we send people? Where would you like to direct them to? Amazon for the book. Where can they go to check you guys out?
We're both on Twitter. I am at CF Chabris, and Dan is at Prof. Simons, ProfSimons. And there's also a nice webpage for the book. If you just Google Nobody's Fool, Christopher Chabris, you'll find it. Intriguingly, there are other books and movies called Nobody's Fool, so you've got to really look for ours to find it. And one might argue that we used a bit of a familiarity strategy there of picking a name for our book that people would have heard of already, and it's a common phrase in the language. But once you find our version of it, I think you'll be rewarded.
Christopher, cool stuff. Keep me posted on the next book. You guys write and dig into interesting topics. I thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a great discussion.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash, or just trying to make a lot of money. Trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.